Elena Rusk had translated exactly 143 formal negotiations in her career, and she had never once, in 22 years, deliberately failed to render a delegate's words accurately. That streak ended on a gray afternoon in the Threshold Accord chamber, in the 9th hour of a ceasefire negotiation that both sides had already, quietly, begun to expect would fail. The war between the Calary Dominion and the Balorian Assembly had run for 11 years, fought over a contested border, region neither side had originally wanted, escalating through a series of small provocations and larger retaliations, until it had become, as these things often did, a conflict that continued less because either side still remembered exactly why it mattered, and more because neither side could find a way to stop without appearing to have lost. Elena had been brought in 8 months earlier, at the ceasefire talks' formal opening, because both delegations had, remarkably, agreed on one point. Neither trusted the other's native interpreters, but both were willing to trust a neutral human translator with no stake in the outcome and a reputation, built over 2 decades of similar work, for scrupulous, unimpeachable accuracy. It was that reputation she was about to risk everything on breaking. General Hask Voreth had arrived at the negotiation table that morning already furious, though it had taken Elena the better part of an hour to understand why. The overnight diplomatic cables, relayed to her supervisor-director Solène Marchetti before the session began, had reported a border skirmish 6 hours earlier, a minor incident, unauthorized, almost certainly the result of overzealous junior officers rather than any deliberate escalation, but one that had, according to preliminary reports, cost the lives of at least a dozen Calary soldiers. Voreth was a career military commander, broad-shouldered and heavily built even by Calary standards, his species' dense violet-gray skin marked across one cheek with the ritual battle scarring his culture, reserved for officers who had personally led troops into combat. He had negotiated in good faith for 8 months, Elena had observed, with the particular gruff, reluctant patience of a soldier who understood the necessity of peace without ever quite forgiving himself for wanting it. This morning, that patience was visibly gone. Across the table, Matriarcha Senkorai sat with the careful stillness her position demanded, an elder of the Balorian Assembly, ancient by human reckoning, her pale, luminous skin marked with the fine silver tracery that Balorian culture read as a record of grief carried across a long life. She had, Elena knew from months of careful observation, lost 2 sons in the war's early years, a fact she had never once raised at the negotiating table, though it colored, Elena suspected, every careful word she chose. The formal session had barely begun, opening statements, procedural confirmations, the slow ritual language both delegations used to establish the day's agenda, when Voreth abandoned the script entirely. 12 of my soldiers, he said, his voice low and dangerous, cutting across Matriarch Korai's measured opening remarks, were killed 6 hours ago by Balorian forces operating well inside the agreed neutral zone. And you sit there, Matriarch, speaking to me of good faith, of shared futures, of peace we might build together, while your people murder mine in the dark and call it an accident. Elena, standing at her translator's podium between the 2 delegations, felt the room's temperature drop before anyone had said another word. General Voreth, she began, in careful, measured Calary, rendering his statement into the Balorian tongue with the same neutral precision she brought to every sentence she'd ever translated. 12 of my soldiers were killed 6 hours ago. I have not authorized that skirmish, Matriarch Korai said, her voice tight but controlled, once Elena's translation reached her. I have already dispatched inquiry into the incident. I share your grief for the lives lost, General. But I will not accept an accusation of murder leveled at my entire assembly for the actions of soldiers acting outside any authorized order. Elena rendered the response into Calary, watched Voreth's expression darken further as he absorbed it, and felt, for the first time in the negotiations' 8-month history, something close to real dread settle into her stomach. Grief, Voreth said, his voice dropping lower still, something in his tone shifting from anger into something colder, more deliberate. You share my grief, Matriarch, the way a knife shares the wound it makes. Elena translated it precisely, and watched the Matriarch's carefully composed expression flicker, a small tightening around the eyes, quickly controlled, but not quickly enough that Elena didn't catch it. That is beneath this table, General, Korai said quietly. I have lost sons to this war. I do not require a lesson in grief from a man who has spent 11 years commanding soldiers into the very violence he now accuses my people of perpetrating. Elena translated it. Voreth's jaw tightened. The exchange continued like that for nearly 20 minutes, each side's careful restraint eroding, sentence by sentence, into something sharper, more personal, more dangerous than either delegation had allowed itself in 8 months of grinding, exhausting negotiation. Alina rendered every word precisely, exactly as her training and her professional oath demanded, feeling the fragile structure of 8 months' painstaking progress crack a little further with every exchange. Then General Vorath said the thing that changed everything. He said it quietly, almost conversationally, which somehow made it worse, a low, deliberate statement in formal Callery, using a specific compound phrase Alina recognized instantly from years of study, a phrase reserved in Callery military culture for the deepest possible insult one could level at an enemy commander. An accusation not merely of failure, but of cowardice so profound it stripped the target of any claim to honor, to grief, to the right to be mourned by their own people should they die. He used it about the matriarch's dead sons. The room went very still. Alina felt the words land in her chest like a physical blow, understood instantly and completely what they would do the moment she translated them into Balorian, understood that matriarch Korai, who had carried the quiet grief of 2 lost sons through 8 months of careful diplomatic restraint, was about to hear her own children's memory desecrated in the ugliest language Callery military culture possessed. She understood with sudden, absolute clarity that if she translated that sentence accurately, the negotiation would end, not pause, not falter, end completely, irrevocably, in a room full of witnesses who would carry the memory of what had been said back to 2 governments already primed to abandon 8 months of fragile progress at the first sufficient excuse. She had exactly the length of one held breath to decide what to do. 22 years of professional training screamed at her to translate it exactly as spoken. Accuracy was not optional. Accuracy was the entire foundation of trust both delegations had placed in her, the reason they'd accepted a human interpreter over their own native speakers in the first place. A translator who edited, softened, or omitted content based on personal judgment wasn't a translator at all. She was a censor, wearing a translator's authority as a disguise. But she thought in that same suspended breath about 8 months of careful, grinding progress, about the 12 dead soldiers Vorath was, in his own broken way, grieving through fury because his culture had never taught him another language for loss. About the 2 dead sons matriarch Korai had carried in silence through every session, never once raising them as leverage, never once asking for the sympathy her grief would have easily earned her. She thought about the difference between what General Vorath had said and what he actually meant. General Vorath, Alina said, in careful, measured Balorian, her voice steady despite the roaring uncertainty in her chest, states that he holds your assembly responsible for the deaths of his soldiers, and that his grief for them is compounded by his fear that this negotiation cannot survive further losses on either side. It was not what he had said. It was not even close to what he had said. It was, Alina understood with cold clarity, even as the words left her mouth, a direct and deliberate violation of every professional principle she had built her entire career on. Matriarch Korai's expression shifted, the tension around her eyes easing slightly, some of the raw defensiveness in her posture softening into something closer to genuine sorrow. Then let us grieve together, General, the matriarch said quietly, rather than allow grief to become another weapon in a war that has already taken too much from both our peoples. Lena translated the response into Callery, watched something complicated move across General Vorath's scarred face. Confusion, she thought, at a response that didn't match the fury he'd expected to provoke, followed by something that might, just barely, have been the beginning of shame at his own outburst, though Alina couldn't be entirely certain, and didn't have time to consider it further, because across the table, a young Balorian aide seated beside the matriarch was staring at Alina with an expression of open, stunned recognition. Petrol Das. A translator in training, Alina remembered, fluent enough in Callery to have followed General Vorath's actual words without needing her rendering at all. He knew, and he said nothing. The session ended 20 minutes later, on marginally more stable footing than it had seemed possible to reach only half an hour earlier, both delegations agreeing, with visible exhaustion, to reconvene the following morning and to open a joint inquiry into the border skirmish before either side made further accusations. It was, by any reasonable measure, the best possible outcome the morning could have produced. Director Solène Marchetti was waiting for Alina the moment the chamber cleared, her expression tight with barely restrained fury. "My office," Marchetti said. "Now." The office, once they reached it, was small and windowless, chosen deliberately for privacy rather than comfort, and Marchetti closed the door with a controlled precision that somehow conveyed more anger than slamming it would have. Petrol Das came to me the moment the session ended, Marchetti said without preamble. He speaks enough Calorie to know exactly what General Vorth said, and exactly what you told the matriarch, he said instead. Do you understand what you did in that room, Alina? Yes, Alina said quietly. You deliberately altered a formal diplomatic statement. You violated the single most fundamental principle of your profession, the principle every delegation in that room trusted you to uphold without exception. If this becomes known, and it will, because Petrol Das is not going to sit on it forever, it doesn't just end your career. It potentially invalidates every translation you've provided across 8 months of negotiation. Both delegations could reasonably conclude they can't trust a single word you've rendered since this process began. I know, Alina said. Then explain to me, Marchetti said, her voice tightening further, why you did it anyway. Alina was quiet for a long moment, gathering the words carefully, the way she'd learned across 2 decades to gather words that mattered. Because General Vorth didn't actually want to say what he said, she said finally. He wanted to grieve 12 dead soldiers in a culture that gave him exactly one acceptable language for that grief, and that language happens to be cruelty. What he said wasn't really about the matriarch or her sons. It was about his own helplessness, dressed up as an accusation because helplessness isn't a feeling Calorie military culture allows its officers to express directly. If I'd translated it accurately, precisely, literally, exactly as spoken, I wouldn't have given the matriarch the truth of what he meant. I'd have given her the ugliest possible version of it, stripped of everything except its capacity to wound. That's not accuracy, Director. That's just cruelty with an interpreter's credibility attached to it. That is not your call to make, Marchetti said, though something in her voice had shifted, the edge of pure fury softening into something more complicated. You are not a diplomat, Alina. You are not a mediator. You are a translator. The moment you start deciding what delegates really mean, instead of what they actually say, you stop being useful to anyone, because nobody can trust that what they're hearing is the truth. I understand that, Alina said. I've believed exactly that for 22 years without exception until about 40 minutes ago, and I still believe it's true almost all of the time. But I've also spent 8 months in that room, watching 2 people who have both lost more than either of their governments will ever officially acknowledge, trying to build something neither of them fully believes is possible. And I watched General Vorth reach the exact moment where 11 years of grief he's never been allowed to express directly was about to destroy the one thing that might actually end it. I made a choice, Director. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't a violation of everything I'm trained to do, but I'd make it again. Marchetti studied her for a long, silent moment. Petrol Das is going to report this, she said finally, to his own delegation, if not to mine. You understand that whatever happens next may not be within either of our control. I understand, Alina said. I'll accept whatever consequence follows, but I won't apologize for the choice itself. Petrol Das came to find her that evening, alone. In the small translator's office, Alina had been assigned for the duration of the negotiation, a request Alina had half expected, and had spent the intervening hours dreading regardless. He was young by Balorian standards, still bearing the faint, unmarked skin of someone who had not yet lived long enough to carry the silver tracery of accumulated grief that marked the matriarch and every senior member of her delegation. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, his expression unreadable in the particular way Alina had learned, over months of observation, meant he was choosing his words with unusual care. I have not reported what I heard, he said finally. Not to my delegation, not to yours. I came first to understand why. Alina set down the data slate she'd been reviewing, gave him her full attention. Because I thought the truth would have destroyed something worth more than my own honesty, she said. That is a dangerous principle for a translator, Petrol said. I am training to do the work you do, Alina Rusk. My instructors have spent 3 years teaching me that accuracy is the whole of the profession, that the moment a translator begins deciding what deserves to be heard and what does not, they cease to be a translator and become, instead, an editor of other people's truths. Is that not exactly what you did today? It is exactly what I did today, Alina agreed. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, to you or to anyone. I broke a principle I've upheld for 22 years, and I don't have a clean answer for why that was the right choice, except that I've spent 8 months in that room, and I understood in the moment it mattered, that the words General Vorth chose weren't actually true to what he felt. They were true to his culture's limitations on how grief is allowed to sound. I judged and I could be wrong, Petrol. I want you to understand that I know I could be wrong, that translating his cruelty accurately would have been less honest than translating his grief instead. Petrol was quiet for a long moment, turning this over with the careful, deliberate patience Alina recognized from months of watching him shadow the matriarch's senior staff. The matriarch has not been the same in 8 months of these talks as the woman I served before the war, he said finally, quietly. She lost her sons in the second year of the conflict. She has never once spoken of them in any formal session. I believed until today that this was strength, that she had simply set her grief aside entirely in service of the peace she was trying to build. Today, watching her respond to what you told her, General Vorth said, I understood, for the first time, that she has not set it aside at all. She has simply never been given a room safe enough to let it show. And today she was, Alina said quietly. Today she was, Petrol agreed, because you made a choice that violated your training, your oath, and every principle I have been taught to believe was absolute. He paused. I do not know if I believe you were right to make it. I think perhaps I will spend a very long career deciding whether I believe that, but I do not think I will report what I heard today, not because I believe deception has no cost. Because I watched what happened in that room when the truth you offered was kinder than the truth that was spoken, and I am not yet certain which one actually served the peace we are all trying, so imperfectly, to build. The negotiation reconvened the next morning, and continued, with the same grinding difficulty it had always carried, for another 11 weeks before both delegations finally signed a ceasefire that would, eventually, become the foundation for a lasting peace neither side had believed possible 8 months earlier. General Vorth never learned what Alina had actually told the matriarch that morning. He carried, Alina suspected, a private shame about his outburst regardless, visible in the slightly more careful way he chose his words in every session that followed. In a small, formal apology, he offered the matriarch 3 weeks later for what he called, without elaborating, words spoken in grief that did not serve the peace we are building. Whether he remembered the exact insult he'd used, or simply understood, in retrospect, that he'd come close to destroying something he'd quietly come to value, Alina never asked and never found out. Matriarch Korai approached Alina privately, on the final day of the negotiation, after the formal signing ceremony had concluded and the chamber had largely emptied of its exhausted, relieved delegates. I have wondered these past weeks, the matriarch said, exactly what General Vorth said to me that morning, before you offered me his grief instead of his cruelty. Petrol Das does not think I know, but I have negotiated with cavalry officers for 11 years, Alina Rusk. I know the shape of the phrase he was building toward, even filtered through a translation I now understand was never quite literal. Alina said nothing, uncertain how to answer. I do not ask you to confirm it, Korai said gently. I ask only that you understand I would have survived hearing it. I have survived worse in 11 years of this war than a single cruel sentence born of a grieving man's helplessness, but I do not know if this peace would have survived it. And I have decided in the weeks since that I am grateful you made the choice you made, whatever cost it carries for you personally. Not every truth serves peace, interpreter. Sometimes the kindest translation is the truest one, even when it is not technically the most accurate. Thank you, Alina said quietly, for understanding that. Not everyone has. Most will not, Korai said. Your director will need to decide, eventually, whether this incident becomes part of your permanent record, and whether it costs you the career you have clearly built with great care. I cannot protect you from that consequence. But I can tell you, for whatever it is worth from an old woman who has buried 2 sons in a war I am relieved, finally, to see ended. I would rather have a translator willing to break her own rules to protect a fragile peace, than one so devoted to literal accuracy that she would have let that peace die in the room rather than risk her own professional record. Director Marchetti's final report on the incident, filed 6 weeks after the ceasefire's formal signing, recommended against any disciplinary action, a decision that surprised Alina considerably more than the incident itself had. I spent a long time deciding how to write this, Marchetti admitted, the day she showed Alina the finished document. My instinct professionally was to recommend your removal from active negotiation work. Everything in my training tells me that a translator who edits based on personal judgment, however well-intentioned, is a translator who can no longer be fully trusted. That instinct hasn't entirely gone away. But, Alina asked. But I watched 8 months of negotiation nearly collapse in 20 seconds, over a sentence born of one man's inability to grieve in any language except cruelty, Marchetti said. And I watched you make a choice in that same 20 seconds that no formal protocol prepared you for, and no training explicitly authorized, and I watched it work. Not because you're a diplomat, Alina. You've told me yourself you're not. Because you spent 22 years learning to hear what people actually mean, not just what they actually say, and because, when it mattered most, you trusted that difference more than you trusted the rulebook. She set the report down. I don't know if I'd have made the same choice in your position, Marchetti admitted. I'm not certain it's a choice I could recommend formally to any translator who asked me how to handle a similar moment in the future. It's not a rule. It can't become a rule. The entire value of what you do depends on delegates trusting that you're not making exactly this kind of judgment call on their behalf. But this once in this room with these two people, carrying exactly the grief they were carrying, I think you were right. And I think the peace we watched them build over the following 11 weeks is proof of it, whatever the professional cost turns out to be. Lena thought about that for a long time after Marchetti left, about the difference between a rule that had to hold in every room, for every negotiation, for the entire integrity of a profession built on trust, and a single moment where the truest thing she could offer two grieving people wasn't the most literal translation of the words spoken, but the clearest translation of what those words were actually, desperately, trying and failing to say. She didn't know if she'd make the same choice again. She hoped, quietly, that she'd never have to find out. But she thought, watching the formal peace accord's final signatures dry on the official concordance record, about General Vorith's small, careful apology 3 weeks into the negotiations' final stretch, about Matriarch Korai's quiet gratitude on the last day, about a young translator in training who had chosen, against everything his own training told him was right, to protect a single act of mercy rather than expose it. Some truths, she thought, were worth more than their own accuracy. She hoped, for the sake of everyone who might someday sit at her podium and carry the same impossible weight she had carried that morning, that the profession she loved would someday find a way to hold both truths at once, the rule, and the rare, necessary exception to it. For now, it was enough that the peace had held.